Our Torah portion today is Kedoshim, which is holy or holies, literally. It's taken from Leviticus chapter 19, beginning in verse 1, and goes over into chapter 20. But before we get into that, let's acknowledge that today is the 14th day of the counting of the Omer. And if you are new to some of this and you're not sure what all that means, I'm going to give a very, very brief explanation. On the day after the Sabbath, once after Pesach, and then the day after the Sabbath, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were to bring a sheaf offering to the temple. And this is the day that we know as the first fruits. And from that day, we begin to count towards Shavuot, and we count 50 days. You can read that in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15. So today, we count the 14th day, which means we have, how's your math today? 36, yes, very good. So today is the 14th day, but I just want to share something a little bit more, perhaps applicable, relevant. The word Omer, I don't have it to show you in Hebrew here, but it's Ayin Mem Resh, Omer, it's a measurement. And they were to bring an Omer, or count an Omer. That was first introduced in Exodus chapter 16 when the manna began to fall from heaven. God gave the people their daily bread, 6 days out of 7. There was a double portion on the 6th day, of course. But they were to go out and collect an Omer. And so it's kind of tied to that idea that God gives us our daily bread, which is why it's interesting that the word Omer, Ayin Mem Resh, is related to the word Aleph Mem Resh, which is Amar, which means to say or to speak. And so each and every day, as we count the Omer, we should all listen to see what he's speaking to us during that time. To believe that not only does he give us our physical bread, but he's going to give us that bread from heaven that we need each and every day. And so we pray, give us this day our daily bread. Now, I need to go ahead and address this because I've gotten some emails, some texts, and among other things, asking why are we doing it differently than our Jewish friends? And it's very, very simple. We do typically follow the Hillel calendar, and I know that doesn't set well with some, but we do. And we're not going to get into the reasons why particularly, but one of the things that we do deviate from is I firmly believe that what the scripture tells us in Leviticus chapter 23 as to when we start counting the Omer is on the day after the Sabbath. And our Jewish friends consider the first day of unleavened bread to be the Sabbath that is referred to there, and therefore they start counting on the day following, which would be the second day of unleavened bread, which means that Shavuot is always going to fall on the 6th day of the month called Sivan. And it seems to me that if the Creator, who tells us on the 14th day of Aviv you do this, on the 15th day you do that, on the first day of the 7th month you do this, you sound trumpets, on the 10th day is a day that you will afflict your souls. It seems to me that if he wanted it always to be on the 6th day of the month called Sivan, he would have said, and on the 6th day of the 3rd month. But he didn't do that. He said, start counting on this particular day, which is a very, very boiled down, concise, and basic reason of why we started counting the Omer on the first day of the week after Pesach during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which brings us to the 14th day. Okay? So this is really not my message today, but because we do get so many people asking, wanting to know why we're doing it differently, this, that, and the other, I wanted to briefly explain. Now, I do want to say this, because this is typically what happens on the live stream. Now, we don't do it here because you're all paying attention, hopefully. But on the live stream, this is usually when some people find that it's necessary to start going into a dissertation about this, that, or the other. So I want to challenge everybody who's listening right now, whose brains are going like this because we mentioned calendars, to restrain yourself from going into a dissertation of why we should do this and why we should do that and this calendar and that calendar. In fact, I want to go so far as to say, because we would not allow that kind of a discussion to break out while I'm trying to teach, here, we're not going to allow it out there either today. So then, you have been challenged. We'll use that word, okay? And I want to challenge my moderators to enforce what I'm saying here, which means if somebody finds it necessary to go into a long dissertation about calendars and counting and things like this, email the office, write me, however you want to do it. That would be the appropriate time to do that, but not today on the chat while we're going to be discussing some other things. Does that sound okay to y'all? Sounds appropriate? So the people in here agree. I hope everybody out there on the chat agrees as well. So while we're on the fun subject of calendars, I want to go ahead and say this as well, because there are some right now who are not even addressing Hallel calendar versus, the way we count the Omer, but there's it's about that time for a new controversy to enter in to the Hebrew roots community. And guess what? Calendar issues. So there are some people I know, people I'm friends with, who have adopted what some are called the Melchizedek calendar, some are calling the Zadok calendar, the Jubilee calendar, and things like that. And I know that we have people here that will disagree with me as far as calendars go. But we've agreed as a congregation that we're going to we're kind of do things together, right? And every individual is left to pursue what they believe and what their heart's conviction is on a personal, individual level without bringing disruption to the congregation at large, okay? For instance, there are some people in our congregation here who will observe Shavuot on the 6th day of the 3rd month. That's fine. But as a congregation, we're counting this is the 14th day of the Omer as we work toward Shavuot, okay? So you understand what I'm saying. Every individual is entitled to follow their heart's conviction on these matters without bringing disruption to the fellowship and to the assembly at large, right? Okay. So that also applies to what's going on now with people who are wanting to suggest that the whole body needs to move from one calendar to another and adopt the Zadok calendar, the Melchizedek calendar. I've heard all kinds of titles given. It's being repackaged. It's something that's been around for a long time. And I know that there will be people who will really sign on to this, and that's fine as an individual. But we're not going to allow that to disrupt what we're doing as a congregation. So I want to reiterate that. We're not going to allow that to disrupt what we do as a congregation. Okay? So now let me challenge those online once again. For those who will want to, well, this is why, and da-da-da. No, not the time for that today. If you want to express your opinion about that particular calendar and way of accounting things, I'm happy to receive your emails. I may not respond to them all, but I'm happy to receive them all. I'm happy to read your letters and things like this. If you feel like you need to express yourself in that. But you should all know that I went through this 30 years ago. I've already fought that battle. My mind's made up, and as a congregation, we need to be on the same page, okay? At the same time, allowing for individuals to follow their convictions unless it brings disruption inside here. Okay, does anybody have any questions about that? You can ask me after the service. Okay, I hope that I came across clear, firmly, and polite. But I'm pretty adamant about it. All right? Do we need to pray again? All right, let's go to our Torah portion. Leviticus 19, beginning in verse 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." You may already know this, but this portion and the previous portion, Achremot, are considered to be Lev HaTorah, the heart of the Torah. And if those two portions together are the heart of the Torah, I would recommend to you that this particular chapter that we just read from is the heart of the heart. It's the epicenter of the Torah. because it summarizes the essence of the Torah. And that is that God is holy and he's called us to be a holy people. And so in this chapter and in this portion, he describes to us what holiness looks like. Because he is holy, we are to be holy. Now, I grew up in a quote-unquote holiness church. Some of you know what I'm talking about there. And there were expressions of holiness. A lot of times, at least in my mind as a child and a teenager growing up, those expressions of holiness were about what it looked like on the outside. You don't go to movies. You don't go to dances. Things like that. You don't wear jewelry other than a wedding band. And not that I'm criticizing that, but it just seemed to me as a child that that was the emphasis. That's where it was placed, on what it looked like outside. But really, holiness, and I know that you know this, it goes well beyond what it looks like on the outside. Holiness, in fact, dominates this particular book, Leviticus. But really, it dominates the entire Bible, all of Scripture. Because if this is the heart of the Torah, this is the Father's heart, expressing his heart to us. And what is he expressing? I'm holy, you be holy. What does that mean? Well, don't mix things that are unclean with what is holy. Don't bring your bath water and mix it with the drinking water. The bath water has its purpose, but drinking water is supposed to be pure and untainted and unpolluted. And so in our lives, we need to follow that example. That's why, and I'm not really going to get into the details of this, you'll see things like that you're not to use different kinds of seed in your field. You're not to sow, to use the King James, diverse seed in your field. This connects, by the way, to the parable of the wheat and the tare. That's the whole concept there. The Father has a field, which is the world. He sows good seed in it. His intention is that it would be sown only with good seed, and that good seed would produce what kind of fruit? Good, thank you very much. All right. But his enemy comes in under the cover of darkness and sows a different kind of seed, which everybody that heard Yeshua talk about this parable, they would have immediately picked up on what it says in Leviticus, that you're not to sow your field with different kinds of seed. They would have immediately understood the implications of what he was saying. So, that's what it means. Don't mix things that are unclean with things that are clean. Things that are common, don't mix with those things that are considered to be holy. If you have garments, don't have a garment that's wool and linen mixed together. Why is that? And I know that there are a lot of, is this the right way to put it, chemical reasons, practical reasons that you don't do that. It's no need to comment on that either. But the point is that, to go beyond that, is suggesting that, wool comes from something that breathes. God breathed life into that animal. And then there are things that grow from the earth. When Abel brought an offering, compare what God says to that offering compared to what he says to Cain's offering and what kind of offerings were brought. And so it suggests to me that, yes, beyond the literal, chemical, practical reasons that you don't wear garments that have linen mixed with wool, it's to say don't let your garments, don't let it be, those things that are supposed to be spiritual, don't let it be tainted with things that are earthy and carnal. Because you are supposed to represent him. I am supposed to represent him. And so our garments should be pure and holy, right? Our God is completely free from anything that is imperfect or impure. And therefore, he is not subject to death. So let me say that again. He is free from things that are impure and imperfect because he's holy. And because he's holy, he provokes you and I to strive for that same kind of freedom that he experiences, that he is. To be free from things that are impure, from things that contaminate. Not so that we would become as gods, because that's the satanic lure. You'll just be like God. You'll know everything that God knows. And that's what tripped Eve up. But not that we would become as gods, but that we would be joined to God, to emulate godly attributes, to emulate godly characteristics in this world. As we go into this world, that our garments would be pure and untainted by the world. Now, we cannot emulate his omnipresence. We can't be everywhere at one time, although there are some people who feel that others should. We can't be emulating his omnipotence. He's all powerful. We don't know everything. So those are things that we cannot emulate, those characteristics and attributes that are unique to our God. However, we can strive to emulate him in that we can remove ourselves or set ourselves apart from things that defile. And he defines for us what those things are. We can emulate him in striving to embrace purity. We can emulate him in trying to propagate the virtues that he demonstrates for us, which are, here's a few, according to his own description in Exodus chapter 34. He is merciful. We can learn to be merciful. 3 of you agreed with that, all right? He is gracious. We're supposed to be gracious. He's long-suffering. What does that mean? Suffering long, all right? Not just today, but the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. He is long-suffering. We can emulate that attribute. He says that he abounds in goodness and in truth. That's something we need to strive for as well. He forgives iniquity and transgression of sin. Now, we cannot forgive sin. We cannot clear the guilty. Only he can do that. But we can extend mercy. We can extend long-suffering and graciousness. So let's address this, and I think we've brought this up before. God describes himself far more merciful and gracious and long-suffering than he does judgmental. Would you agree with that? All right, we're up to 5 or 6 now. How about the rest of you? Okay, do we agree that that's how he kind of presents himself? Right? He does not allow the guilty to go and get away with things. But he's far more gracious, merciful, forgiving than he is ready to judge. So here's my point. That is how he wishes to be perceived. Would you agree with that? And if he wishes to be perceived that way, I would recommend to you that's how he wishes for you and I to be perceived by others. Far more merciful, long-suffering, gracious, and willing to forgive than we are to bring the hammer down. At the beginning of the Torah, Adam sinned, and what did God do? Yeah, he exiled him from the garden, but he clothed him before he sent him out naked. He covered his shame. At the end of the Torah, what did he do? He said to Moses, you're not going into the land because you did not hallow me in the eyes of the people. But at the same time, God himself buried Moses. So even when he is dispensing justice, he is merciful. He's long-suffering. He doesn't expose shame. He covers it. He heals. He frees captives. This is who he is. He does good to his enemies, and he extends mercy to those who don't deserve it, which means each and every one of us. Can we say amen to that? Amen. So then, there are certain things that we cannot emulate. There are things that we can. And to try to emulate his holiness, to be a faithful representation of who and what he is, I would suggest to you that this is the ultimate act of worship. To be what he is, to try to be what he is. Do we do that on our own power? Of course we do not. We need his spirit. We need his word. And yet, if he calls us to be holy, I don't think he calls us to be something that he knows it's impossible for us to be. He doesn't say, I want you to do this, and then not give us the tools and the equipment that we need in order to do the very thing that he's called us to do. Right? So we should strive to be a holy people. And that means to emulate the one who is holy. So then, true worship is to strive to emulate the one you say you love. Yeshua said, if you love me, keep my commandments. All right? And, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Being holy is not trying to gain the upper hand over somebody. Being holy is not trying to be viewed as superior over someone. It is to be dedicated to the same values that God is dedicated to. So as I said earlier, this portion provides for us a description of what holiness is. And here's just a few things, just a few. Things that maybe we don't think about as much. Reverence for parents. I'd throw grandparents into that too. And in some cases, great-grandparents. Which then leads to the next one. And respect for the elderly. Reverence for parents. Respect for the elderly. Consideration for the needy. And how we deal with our fellow man. We should do it honorably, even those that we don't like. According to the Torah portion, holiness is represented by providing prompt wages for reasonable work hours. Treating the stranger and a foreigner with respect. Being truthful, not being a tale bearer. It is to exhibit equal justice. Notice I did not say social justice. Equal justice. And to have an abhorrence of things that are unclean, those things that are profane, those things that, the bath water contaminating the drinking water. Now, when we think of his commandments, or let me rephrase this, I think a lot of people approach God's commandments this way, not necessarily the people in this room or online. But nonetheless, many commandments are typically regarded as being negative. In other words, I don't get to do what I want to do. Okay? And I think, for me, the first one that pops into my head is certain things that we're said, if you're going to be a holy people, you should not eat certain things. And my first response to that many years ago was, I don't get to do what I want to do. And so, like most, I try to find loopholes. Try to find ways around, justification for letting the scripture allow me to do what I want to do. Well, that's typically how humans approach this. I don't get to do something I really want to do. But freedom to do what I want to do really isn't freedom. Because what that is really expressing is a bondage to my flesh. There's a rabbinic adage that says that liberty without law will result in anarchy or lawlessness. Freedom to just do whatever I want to do is not freedom. That is not liberty. That is lawlessness. That is anarchy. And so this notion that liberty needs law, needs boundaries, if it is going to truly be liberty, that notion connects Passover, unleavened bread, with Shavuot, which is one of the reasons that we count the Omer. We start counting the Omer during the time of unleavened bread, working our way toward Shavuot to demonstrate that there is a connection between the two. There's a connection between what happens at Passover, what happens at unleavened bread, and what takes place at Shavuot. In fact, Shavuot is referred to as Atzeret, which is kind of the conclusion of what is initiated at Passover. Because he didn't liberate them from Egyptian bondage just so that they could go do whatever they wanted to do and end up being in bondage to their own desires and inclinations. He liberated them at Passover to bring them to Sinai so that he could give them instructions and boundaries and commandments and how to live so that they could truly live as a free people. Because remember, God is free from anything that contaminates and corrupts, and therefore is not subject to death. And he wants you and I to be free from anything that contaminates and corrupts so that we might have eternal life, right? So these ideas are connected. And when we live as a truly free people, that is a holy people, that is how we best represent him in this world as his sons and his daughters. So rather than looking at his commandments as, I can't do what I really want to do, perhaps we should view those kinds of commandments as things he tells us to refrain from because it is in our best interest. Because if we will refrain from these things and restrain ourselves in certain situations, then we are going to free ourselves of those things that would contaminate and that would corrupt so that we could be more like him. And furthermore, he doesn't just say, don't do this, he says, do that. And sometimes when he says, do this instead of doing that, there are some people who say, well, I don't want to do that. That's too hard. That's not fun. Maybe we should look at these things as not things I have to do, but things that I get to do. Things that I get to and should participate in. I won't call the name. A couple of years ago, I was asked to have a conversation with a gentleman who just really doesn't understand what I'm about and how I'm trying to live, and he thinks it's this and that and the other, and so the question of commandments and Torah and things like that came up, and his perspective was that only Jews have to do these things. You're not Jewish, you don't have to do these things. And I said, well, what if I want to do these things? What's wrong with me wanting to do these things that I know pleases the Father? So I don't look at it as something I have to do. I look at it, or should look at it, as things that I get to do because he allowed us to come in and be part of the family. Okay? So how we see these things might determine the disposition of our heart. Because a rebellious son, he will see them as things I have to do, or things that I don't really want to do, but I have to do them. And I don't get to do what I want to do. Where the obedient son sees them as loving instructions given by a father who has his best interest in mind. All right. So now, Israel, of course, is identified as God's son, my firstborn, and Israel is considered to be a kingdom of priests. Therefore, holiness was required of the entire congregation, not just a few select people, but the entire congregation. In fact, in Exodus 19, he speaks to the nation and says, you will be to me a kingdom of priests, and the Goy Kadosh, a holy nation. Everybody. That's what Israel's call is. And inherent within this call is the notion that Israel is to be a free people, and by that we mean to be free from the bondage of sin and all the things that were represented by being in Egypt, having to follow somebody else's rules and live under their boot heel or sandal heel, whatever it was. Maybe I should have just said heel. Anyhow. So it's emblematic that you and I as his people are to be free from the bondage of sin, but not free just to do whatever it is we want to do, but to be a people who are ready and willing to serve him as bondservants. Yeshua is the example. He's the ultimate example, right? He doesn't sin. He doesn't commit sin, right? He becomes sin for us, but he doesn't commit any sin. He's free from that. And yet, what does he pray? Not my will. And so in demonstrating and exhibiting the freedom in God, we have to be of the mind, but it's not my will that is to be performed here. In John chapter 8, I'm kind of tempted to get into a little bit more detail about the bondservant, but I'm going to restrain myself. I'm not going to ask you to do something I'm not willing to do myself. All right? But I believe that he alludes to the laws of the bondservant in John chapter 8. When he says that anyone who who serves sin is a slave to sin. He talks about that. But then he says, a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. And just very quickly, in the laws of the bondservant, after 6 years, he could go do his own thing. But if he says in his heart, I love my master, I don't want to do my own thing, he would be taken to the door of that house and would literally be affixed to the door of that house, but emblematic of the fact that he wanted to be joined to his master's house and to serve him not another 6 years, but forever. And so a servant does not abide in the house forever. A son abides forever. And then he says this, therefore, if the Son makes you free, you are free indeed. And so what does he teach us here? The bondservant doesn't go his own way doing his own thing. Why? Because he loves his master. and he performs his master's will and is consequently considered not to be a servant, but a son. And as a son, the master provides for him. As a son, the master protects him. As a son, the master nurtures him. So then, as a son, we are free from bondage, but not free to do just whatever we want to do. We are free from the bondage of sin. We're free from the bondage of our flesh, but we have been bonded into his service to be sons and daughters. Now let's consider what Paul says here in 2 Corinthians. Chapter 3. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now, growing up in a Pentecostal church, we had a little slightly different take on this. What we thought that meant is the Spirit of the Lord is there. There is liberty to run the aisles and jump on the pews and shout and carry on, things like that. Things that would scare Baptists out the door. Anyway, remember the first time I took my girlfriend, that lady there, to church with my mother. Her eyes was that big around, man. Yeah, she stayed. That's right. She stayed. That's right. And then her mother came one time. This has nothing to do with my message. But, Pentecostal church, altar service, sometimes it can get a little lively, And some people go up there to pray and somebody will pray for them and back they go, Well, her mother saw that, and that's the first time she'd ever seen that. And she goes, "Is he okay?" All right, so that's how we kind of looked at it back then. But what is he really getting at here? What is meant by the word liberty? It means that one is able to move freely because he is a citizen. He's not a stranger. He's not an illegal immigrant. He can move around freely within the parameters that are established by the law of the land. So he enjoys the benefits of that. But in the context of a bondservant, what we're talking about here, and the whole notion of being a holy people, if I truly want to live free, then I must be willing to surrender my freedom. Can I say that again? I think I will. If I truly want to live free in the way God intends, free of things that corrupt, free of things that contaminate, to be more like him in that regard, if I truly want to live free, then I have to be willing to surrender my freedom. I have to be willing to say, not my will, but your will be done. I have to be willing to live according to the boundaries that are established by the Word of God. Now, let's juxtapose that concept with how this culture, defines freedom and liberty in this day and time. Let's consider how the culture behaves today, and there are different whims, because they think, and I'm speaking in a very general way now, they think freedom means doing whatever I want to do, whenever I want to do it, however I want to do it, and get this, and doesn't really matter how it might infringe on the rights and liberties of others, which is why we have young people who are, and some not so old young people, let me say that again, young people and some not so young, setting up these stupid, ridiculous encampments on these universities, and all the people who are up there supposed to be in charge are, I don't know what to do. And the whole while, what are they doing? They're demanding freedom for people who are holding other people captive. All right? Now, it's stupid, it's chaotic, it's lawlessness is what it is. Okay? Because you see, liberty without law results in lawlessness. And it's just fascinating to me that a lot of these kids that are in these encampments are going to law school. it kind of gives you a little snapshot of the future, folks, if this is the mindset of the culture. You ever heard this guy, Aleister Crowley? Back in the early part of the 20th century, he formed a religious philosophy that's called thelema, which is the Greek word for will. Aleister Crowley. But he formed this religious, it was occultic, it was, all kinds of things. But its motto was this: do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Now compare that philosophy to what Yeshua says. Not my will, but your will be done. But Mr. Crowley and his followers, they viewed this idea of doing whatever you want to as that's what everything's about. They considered that to be a basic and an intrinsic right. And he codified his law, and I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, in liber oz. And I don't know what he meant by OZ, but I know what I'm thinking. Anyway, here's what it says. There is no God but man. Each person has the right to live by one's own law. Live in the way that one wills to do. Work, play, and rest as one wills. Die when and how one wills. Think about that. Eat and drink what one wills. Live where one wills. Move about the earth as one will. Think, speak, write, draw, paint, carve, etch, mold, build, and dress as one will. Love when, where, and with whom one will. And kill those who would thwart these rights. So that was the early part of the 20th century. So it's not a new thing. The spirit of Antichrist has been around from the beginning. Okay? God imposes a particular judgment upon Cain. You're going to be a vagabond and a wanderer. But I want you to notice that Cain didn't wander. You know what he did? He went and built a city. And when you build a city, what is that suggesting? I'm not going anywhere. I'll show you, right? So this is the idea. And so I would suggest to you that we see this selfish philosophy very, very prevalent in our culture today. But the irony is they are not free. They're in bondage. They're in bondage to the adversary. They're slaves to sin, and they just don't realize it. But where you and I are concerned, you see, their actions are indicative of what's going on in the world today. And their actions, their lawless behavior is creating a lawless society. And a lawless society is going to give birth to the lawless one, the son of perdition. That guy, everybody is trying to predict who it is. Anyhow, that's what's going on right now. But now, whether these people consciously agree with Crowley or acknowledge his philosophy, their deeds, their actions are indications that that's what's in their heart. They may have never heard of this guy. Most of them have never heard of where Gaza is. They couldn't find it on a map. But in their heart, this philosophy has taken root, doing whatever I want to do, because it's born of the adversary. And this is just following the patterns that we see in the very beginning. He told the woman, you won't die, you'll be as God. You'll know everything that God knows. And so this is obviously something the adversary's been using ever since then, and he plants it in the hearts of all of those who reject what he has to say. When he spoke to Cain, he said, you know what to do, why don't you do what's right? But instead of receiving that word, he rejected it, and sin was ready at the door to pounce. And that's exactly what happened. So, Crowley, Satanists, New Agers, secularists, millennials, all these different people who have adopted this mindset, in reality are striving to be as God, because they've decided they are God over their own life. It's my body. No, it's on loan. Anyway, when people decide what's best for them, they are selfish, not selfless. And you and I are called to be selfless. That's what the call to be a holy people is all about. Self-denial, saying no to me, sometimes saying no to others, saying yes to his will. And if we're not careful, we can be, and to some degree the body has been influenced by this selfish mentality. Put that Hebrew word up on the screen for me. I've showed this to you several times before, but we're going to do it again. The word kadosh, holy, set apart, it comes from the root kadash, which is kuf dalit shin. And that root word means something that is dedicated. And so when God says, I am holy, therefore you be a holy people, what he's saying is you are dedicated unto me. You're consecrated unto me. You're mine. And so being mine, my sons and daughters behave the way my household behaves. Emulate me. Watch me. Pattern your life after what you see me do, how you see me act. Those kinds of things. That's what it means. You're dedicated, consecrated to God. But I want you to compare the word kadosh or the root kadash to another family word, and that is kadesha. Do you have that to show everybody? Kadesha is the feminine form of that word. But this word here, which comes from the same root word, to be consecrated, to be dedicated, is used in Scripture to speak of a temple prostitute. Someone who was set apart for a completely different purpose, an unclean purpose. And when I think of this idea, I can't help but think of that woman who rides that beast in Revelation chapter 17. She's all decked out in this fancy apparel, but she's got this cup that's full of the abominations, right? Because she's committed fornication with the kings of the earth. So that brings me back to the idea of what Mr. Crowley said, do what thou wilt, that is the whole of the law. That is a carnal mindset. And that's where the world is right now. They may not, claim to be followers of Crowley or any other, rebel, starting with Cain and Nimrod. They may be completely oblivious to those people, but their actions, their attitude says, I'm going to do what I want to do. It's the same spirit of Antichrist that we've seen from the very beginning. So, said all that to say this. That's not who you and I are supposed to be. We're supposed to be bondservants. We haven't been liberated to do whatever it is we want to do, to think what we want to think, to say what we want to say, to act in any way we want to act. We were set free from sin in order to be bondservants to the Most High, to surrender our freedom to the will of God, and thereby truly become a free people, which is to say a holy, set-apart people. I've said this many times, and I'll say it again. We are set apart not to be different for the sake of being different. We are set apart for the sake of making a difference. That is the call that is given to Israel, to be a kingdom of priests, a set-apart nation, in order to make a difference in the world, not to be isolationists, not to be us four and no more. It's not supposed to be that way. If it was that way, then why did he tell his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel of this kingdom, making disciples of all of the nations? And so again, we're set apart not to be different for the sake of being different. And sometimes, I believe, there are people, and I have to say in this community, not this necessarily this assembly, I'm talking about a community at large of people who are trying to adopt his ways and return to the commandments and the instructions and the feasts and those kinds of things. There are those people in this community, this way of thinking, that I do believe falter in this at times. In other words, they're more interested in being different from everybody than they are in making a difference. And that sometimes will show up in the different things that we fuss, feud, and fight over. There are some people, and I know I'm going to get in trouble. I've said this before, and I'll say it again to make the point. I'm not really interested, could care less what the earth's shape is. What I think we should be more interested in is the shape the earth is in. You understand what I'm saying? I'm not really interested in being different for the sake of being different. Some of us have been different all of our lives, right? Some of us have always been square pegs in round holes, right? Maybe that's why God tapped us on the shoulder and whispered in our ear to come this way. But he didn't call us to be a square peg in a round hole so that we can say, look how different I am. He said, I want you to make a difference. I want you to inspire others to want to be a set-apart people, a holy people. That's what this is all about. That is the call that is given to Israel at Sinai, to be a kingdom of priests. It's echoed by Peter when he said that you and I, those of us who are in Messiah, are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. And if we're to be a kingdom of priests, if we're to be a holy nation, then the insinuation is we're to be an example to others. So then, contrary to what some people teach and believe, holiness is not obtained by fleeing from the world and being isolated from the world. That does not make somebody holy. If you think holiness is moving to Montana and living on a commune and sitting around going, that's not holiness. It's not that. It is demonstrated by doing what is right while we are in the world, while we're engaging those who are in the world. We're called to be a set apart people, not a segregated people. Matthew 5, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. And if it can't be hidden, that means people are going to be drawn to it. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So let your light shine before men. Why? That they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. He seems to be saying everything but go find some corner and sequester yourself and just hang out with people you like. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, let's be that city on a hill that is a light to those who are in darkness, that those who are in that darkness might be inspired to come out of that darkness into his marvelous light. So this is the call, to give that light, to be that light, to reflect his light. Because I don't think we're capable of generating our own light. We're kind of like the moon that faces the sun. The sun is the source of the light. Our face needs to be turned to him to reflect that light. And by the way, when is the moon most evident and obvious to us? When it's dark. And so we reflect his light in the darkness that is this world. So we need to make certain that we reflect his character and his attributes authentically and faithfully. We need to act in a way that emulates our Creator. Yeshua says that when we do that, we bring glory to him. So, as a person, I'm to strive to live a holy life. As an assembly, as a fellowship, as a congregation, collectively, we need to strive to faithfully represent him in that way, to be a holy people. And as an assembly, just like as an individual, we need to represent our Father to others in the proper manner. This congregation, and every congregation that calls itself or names itself after the Messiah, needs to be well spoken of in their community. They may not like us, but they should respect what we do and how we behave because we're following the Messiah. There were people in the first century, this is after the Messiah has ascended to the heaven, and this is after Acts chapter 2, and the disciples are going around preaching, making all the religious people mad, making all of the leaders mad, but all the people are listening and watching and responding to this, and even the people who did not believe their message respected them. They respected them. So I think it's very important, ladies and gentlemen, that we represent our Father as a congregation in a way that even those who may not like us has to respect, not because of you or me, because of the one we represent. Okay? It's very important that we do this in humility, that we take no pride in ourselves. We cannot fulfill the call that has been placed upon us if we are isolated, if we're immobilized and ineffective. So then, if imperfect people respond to the message and start showing up in this congregation, well, because, starting with me, all right? But when imperfect people start showing up in this congregation, if the message is faithful and is true, and it's going out and it's drawing imperfect people out of the darkness into the light, then what should we do? Oh, we don't like this. A lot of people have, I don't have much of a filter today, okay? I've been trying, but I am going to say this. From the very beginning of this congregation, it has been a challenge to accommodate the people who want to come, all right? Today's not such a problem, but we have had days just recently when we're packed in here. And if you've been around Jacob's Tent for any length of time, that's kind of the way it's always been, right? Who can testify to that? We've always been kind of packed in here. We've always had to shift this around and flip that around and figure out how we're going to do this, that, and the other. It's been that way from day one, okay? To the point that some will go, well, we're getting too big in here. I liked it better when it was smaller. I did too. But who's going to be the one to stand at the door and say, you can't come in? All right? So then, we don't retreat if people start responding to the message, if it's true, right? And if it's faithful. We don't retreat from that. Should we consider, if these people show up and when these people show up, that somehow or another we've compromised the message? Because why else would all these people be showing up? If somebody's really telling the truth, there's only going to be 2 or 3. I've heard that. So if people start showing up, are we compromising the message? Or is it showing that we're trying to fulfill our commission? If we're striving for holiness, the fruit is going to tell the tale. We'll find out. All right? The ultimate act of worship and the highest ideal that you and I could aspire to is to be everything that God has called us to be, as a person, as a family, as a congregation. We're not going to be able to fulfill that call if we focus on all the wrong things. God expects more of a holy people than just a change in our outward appearance. He expects that there's going to be a change in our heart, that we are going to realize that what freedom really is to be free from all the stuff that pollutes and corrupts. Now, how do you do that if you're going to engage the world? Well, that's why we're probably still in mortal, corruptible bodies, right? It's just part of it. That changes, of course, when we see him as he is. Nonetheless, in our own lives, our own hearts, we should strive not to let it become corrupt and contaminated with the things that do those kinds of things. We're going to get mud on our britches if we're in this world. But thankfully, he is faithful to cleanse us from all those things, right? And to replenish us. So, I'm almost done here. Are y'all still with me? All right. It's a lot more, and we all know this, than just the outward trappings. There is a purpose in appearing in a way and presenting ourselves in a way that is modest and pure. I mean, there's certain things that we shouldn't do, certain ways that we shouldn't go around, certain scenarios that we need to dress modestly and, curb our tongue, not use salty language, All those, yes, there's reason, there's purpose for all that. But that should be an expression and a manifestation of what's already going on within our heart. So in Matthew 23, Yeshua addresses the people who were very zealous for keeping the Torah, but here's what he says to them in verse 23. Woe. That's always a nice way to start a conversation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. I have never in public called anybody a hypocrite. Messiah did it all the time. I really want to be like the Messiah. I've never done that, though. Anyway, you tithe mint, anise, and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law of the Torah, which are what? Justice, mercy, faith. Now, these things you ought to have done, that is, tithe, the mint, the cumin, the anise. Do those things. Do what God tells you to do, but without leaving the others undone. Don't overlook the things that are weightier, the things that are even more important. Then he says this, blind guides. You're blind. You strain out a gnat and you swallow a camel. Lord, I apologize for what I'm about to say. Whether it's this issue, calendars, names, pronunciations, this, that, and the other, yeah, okay, there's a right way to do things. I get it. And I know the Father wants us to do the right thing. And in time, I believe he's going to set us straight on all this kind of stuff. I believe that. Okay. But you know what? You can do the right thing the wrong way. And you can do more harm in trying to be right rather than doing what is right. Okay? So you strain out a gnat and you swallow a camel. I don't want to swallow a camel. They're unclean, first of all. All right. I'd rather eat a gnat. Anyway, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Does it again. Hypocrites. You cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee. First cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. We all know this. We're all familiar with this. But Yeshua uses some pretty strong language talking to these people. Now, let's get this. The problem was not that they were Pharisees. That is not the problem. The problem was not that they were zealous for the Torah. The problem is that they were being very hypocritical about it. How were they being hypocritical? In their zeal to do the commands, the tithe, the mint, the cumin, the anise, and those kinds of things, they overlooked the things that were more important. Justice, mercy, faith. The issue wasn't that they were a Pharisee. The issue was they were a blind Pharisee. They got the outside all shined up, but they didn't work on the inside. They had forgotten what Micah says, chapter 6, verse 8. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what's the word for good? Tov. What does Tov mean? Function in your purpose. Being in the right place, the right time, doing what you're supposed to do. Being where you're supposed to be, doing what you're supposed to be doing. He has shown you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So that, by the way, we quote that verse a lot, but that is in response to a question that is posed in verse 6. Here's the question. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? That's the question. The answer is, do what the Lord requires of you. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. And so then how do I approach a holy God? Seeing that he's called all of us to be holy, those things that Micah just laid out for us. What does it mean to do justly? To do just. The Hebrew term is mishpat, which I believe it means observe his judgments. The things that he said, do this, don't do that, observe those things. Take those to heart. Heed those things. Do what he's asked us to do. Pay the tithe of the mint, the cumin, the anise, and these things. But do it in the right manner, with the right heart, not just as a religious exercise. if no one can stand to be around you, you might be doing it wrong. Well, I'm just being holy and being right. No, maybe you're not. Maybe you're being self-righteous. Okay? Now, I get it that we're a set-apart people, but we're set apart to make a difference, right? So if no one can stand to be around us, might want to do a little self-introspection. Okay? We are to love kindness. Chesed is the term. To love kindness, not just pay lip service to it. To walk out these judgments with kindness and mercy. Not as a religious routine, but to actually, he says, love kindness. Have it in our heart. Here's what Paul says in Ephesians 4. Be kind to one another. Tender-hearted. Forgiving one another. Even as God in Messiah forgave you. And so, in other words, he's saying, well, this is who God is. This is who we should be. Tender-hearted, kind, forgiving one another. Now, I know that there are people who think that being kind is akin to being compromising. To be kind, some people think, is to allow, for anything. And that's not at all what Paul says here. That's not what Micah is saying. There are standards. There are these mishpatim. There are these judgments. And we are to do what God said to do. So there are parameters. Liberty without law ends up being lawless, right? But we do these things in concert with the Spirit of God. In other words, not to be cold, calculating, and condescending. Phony kindness doesn't qualify either. Have you ever met someone who are very proud of the fact that they're humble? They just can't stop telling you how humble they are. You ever met that person? Yeah? It might kind of work the same way here. Phony kindness doesn't meet the standard. We are to be people who truly are kind and to walk humbly. The root word means this, in modesty, discreetly, which is to say in an unassuming manner, without a bunch of pomp and circumstance, without a bunch of, I'm here, I have arrived, right? Like I said, I don't have much of a filter today. Yeshua wasn't, I don't think he was really a great marketer. I mean, if you're wanting to market your message, you don't go around calling people hypocrites and blind guides and snakes and stuff like that. That's not a good marketing plan. Or am I missing something here? Okay. It's not a good marketing plan. So, we don't market the message of the kingdom. We preach the gospel of the kingdom, right? All right, so modestly, discreetly, not calling a lot of attention to ourselves, not seeking publicity, not seeking to gain honor from among men, but to be reserved about how we present ourselves as we preach the gospel of the kingdom, as we walk humbly before our God, not to take pride in self. Yeshua talked about this a little bit in Matthew 6 when he's talking about charity and praying and fasting. He says, if you're fasting, do what? Go do it in private. Don't go out in public, beat your chest and all this kind of stuff. I'm fasting. I'm afflicting my soul. Does everybody see? He said, don't do that. And when you're giving, if you're going to be kind to somebody, don't let one hand know what the other hand's doing. Right? Do it discreetly so you don't bring attention to yourself. Because who is paying attention? The one who really matters. The one who counts. So don't look for recognition from men. Do it as unto the Lord. I said I was almost done 10 minutes ago. Now I'm almost done. Matthew 12, verse 15. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. That's what he does. Yet he warned them not to make him known, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel, nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the street. That to me says he doesn't make a big production about I'm here, not in the way that we would do it, right? He just does what the Father told him to do. He says what the Father tells him to say, right? He's going about doing good without, sending this forward team in there, to get the publicity going and get all the stuff going on. He just goes about doing good. And that just says a lot. Not only that, look at this. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory. And in his name, Gentiles will trust. The pagans, the idolaters, all those people that the Jews did not want to be around. All those that the Jews typically in that day and time segregated themselves from. Remember what Peter said when he went into Cornelius' house? It is not lawful for me to be here. Who said? Not God. God's the one who sent him there. Who was saying it wasn't lawful? His culture, the mindset of the day. But God said to Peter, don't you dare call common what I have cleansed. It might not make sense to your brain, but don't you call common what I have cleansed. So then, the point is this. While holiness is most definitely connected to the notion of keeping the commands, doing these things that God has told us to do, refraining from those things he says don't do. Holiness is equally connected to keeping them in a way that it exhibits the attributes of God. Mercy, modesty, kindness, compassion, those kinds of things. Because it says he will not use words or deeds to break a reed that is already bruised. That has for years been something that when it first really just jumped off the page at me, it just really made a big impact on me. To know that the heart of God is not to break a reed that's already bruised. What is he going to do? He's going to try to mend it. Right? So there are going to be people, there have been people, and there will continue to be people who come into our congregation who are broken, who are bruised, who are beaten up. They may have a bad attitude. They may have a bad outlook. How many of us are exempt from that? Have we always been exempt from that? Have we always been the super believer that we are today? So, should we break them? Or should we try to create an environment that mends them? Hopefully that offers an opportunity for them to be healed. He won't extinguish a fire that is already on the brink of going out. He doesn't just blow it out, be done with you. No, the implication is he shows mercy. And he breathes on it because he wants to revive rather than extinguish. And there were some disciples that said, these Samaritans, they wouldn't make room for you, so would you like for us to call fire down on them and consume them just like Elijah did? Because you just give the word, we're ready. And he rebuked them, didn't he? You do not know what spirit you're of. Son of Man did not come to destroy, but to save. So he shows mercy. He tries to revive what is already broken. And if that's who he is, that's what you and I are supposed to be. We should strive for that. Does that mean we compromise his standards? No, it does not. But we can't compromise his standards in how we walk out doing the things that he's told us to do. We can't compromise in that way either. And so you and I are going to need to be filled with the Spirit of God. Not with ourselves, not with our opinions, not with our agenda. We need to be full of the Spirit of God so that in each and every situation, we know how to do the will of God. Holiness is not a list of do's and don'ts, because do's and don'ts can be easily manipulated to suit me. I can take that do and say, well, I can find a justification. not to. And I can take that don't, and I can find a way to skirt around that and do. It's been done from the very beginning. So it's not a bunch of do's and don'ts. It is living in a way that does not desecrate, profane his name, which is to say his reputation. You've heard me say this many times before. He has, to some degree, entrusted his reputation into our care. We are his representatives in this world, and as far as Jacob's tent goes, in this community, we are his representatives, and to some degree, he has entrusted his reputation into our hands. We need to care for it very, very diligently and in a way that he's going to be happy with. Right? So then, how do people feel about him based on their experience with you? I ask myself the question. How do people feel about the one I serve or the one I say I serve after they have an exchange with me? Do they consider him to be loving, caring, compassionate, uncompromising? Or do they consider him to be cold, rude, calloused, and uncaring? We have been a congregation that from the very beginning, even though we do the Hebrew thing, whatever that is now, we've always been an assembly where we've had people coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. People from hardcore Messianics to tongue-talking, oil-slathering Pentecostals, Wiccans and pagans, literally every kind of background you can imagine. And somehow or another, we've been able to go forward and to, get some bumps and bruises along the way, but to go forward. And that's not because of any man, any woman, any family, any little group of people within that. It's because of the Spirit of God doing a work in all of us. Right? Right? So, if he's done that in us, there's others he wants to do it in. And we need to be the kind of people, as these continue to come into our assembly from all these different backgrounds, we need to understand that, we need to be gracious as they're learning to walk things out. I don't say this too. There are people who take issue that we sing songs sometimes that have Jesus in it. Get over it. Okay? Yeah, we know he's Yeshua. I get that. I know there's no J in Hebrew. I know that. But holiness is a process. It's a process. And some people come in here from all kinds of different backgrounds and they don't know anything. All they know is something is going on here and I want to find out what it is. And it's not you, it's not me, it's not our worship team, it's not the prayer team, it's not the shofar team, it's not the teaching, it's not this, it's that. It's the Spirit of God. And we've been entrusted with his reputation, and we need to be very careful how we care for that and how we handle that. So holiness is a process, and with all due respect, if things like that bug you and you can't swallow that gnat, be careful you don't swallow a camel. Holiness is a process. All I have to do is go to Acts chapter 15 to tell you that that's true. Because they were writing to these non-Jewish believers who didn't know anything about this Moses guy, nothing about Torah. And even James said, look, we've had a hard time with it and we grew up with it. Are we supposed to harass these people and give them a hard time because they're learning about these things? No, we need to give them a place to start. We need to give them some standards to live by so that we can have this exchange and interaction, that we do not, defile ourselves, so to speak. But we need to understand that he's doing something among the Gentiles. Hey, guess what? He's doing something among the Pentecostals. He's doing something among the Baptists and the Methodists and the Lutherans and even the heathens and the Wiccans and the this ones and the that ones. And they're going to come into this congregation with all of that baggage, just like the rest of us came in with all of our baggage. But holiness is a process. And it's the Spirit of God that works in the hearts and lives of men. James did not compromise God's standards. He just allowed for the fact that these people don't know everything yet. We're going to have an opportunity to teach them, and we need to do it the right way because it's God's purpose. He even talked about, and I'm getting long-winded, I know. All right. He even talked about in that same chapter how what's going on here, folks, is what was prophesied by Amos. God is raising up the fallen tabernacle of David, and he's repairing the breaches. He's putting all these tears and rips and things back to play, and that takes some work. And it takes some time. Before he raises this thing up, he's going to put some of these things back together. All right. So, last closing. Because God is holy, he is free from anything that makes mankind imperfect. And that's not just things you eat. That's not just things we do. It also includes how we do. It includes how we think. It includes the doctrines of men. It includes the preconceived notions of what holy is, which might include our religious ideals. In other words, he doesn't necessarily conform to my standards of holiness or your standards of holiness. He presents his standards, and then he says, now you conform to me. What I do and how I do it. And so the freedom that comes along with that, that's what he's calling us to. That's what he's calling us to strive for. Because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, right? To be free from all of those things and to be more like him. So he wants us to strive for that holiness. He wants us to attain the freedom that he has from those things that pollute. This is the heart of the Torah. That's what it is. So, to all of those over online and in here, you know, my intention is certainly not to offend, but we need to hear his heart. And we need to be willing to lay aside our, agenda. And I'm talking to me, too. To hear his heart in the matter. Amen? Amen. Can you agree with that?